All right, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good night, depending where you are in the world. Welcome to my talk at the Qt World Summit. I'm really excited to show you how the Qt installer framework works with Qt6. Now, before I start, I want to talk a little bit about the company that I work for, Integrated Computer Solutions. We offer Qt and QML expertise. In fact, we are the largest source of independent Qt expertise in North America. We've been a Qt service partner since 2002, and we are especially proud of Boston UX, which is our design studio that specializes in intuitive touchscreens. So let me talk about the Qt installer framework. And this is the agenda that I will follow. I will first simply define it at first, give the best definition that I can. I'm going to walk through its tools and input data. I'm going to customize the installer. I am going to talk a little bit about deployment issues. And I am also going to talk about how to integrate it into a build. Now, before I go through the slides, I'd like to show you the end game. So I have my Qt Creator open here. And in the projects page of Qt Creator, I have the project open. And in the projects page, notice how here I've added 3 build steps. The first build step will build my application. The second build step will install it in the appropriate directory. And the third build step that I have here will create a graphical installer for me using the Qt installer framework. And what it looks like is if I hit build, so I'm hitting Control B here, which is the same thing as clicking this arrow. So if I hit Control B, it builds my application, it creates an installer, and on the way of creating an installer, it makes the directory, it makes the application deployable by making sure that all the Qt dependencies are packaged up into the installer. So it takes a little bit of time to create that installer, but it will eventually create it. So let me go to it's generating the installer right now. Takes a little bit of time. All right, so it's been created. And now I'm going to go into the build directory of this project. And I have a beautiful installer like this. You can go through the pages, the typical pages. I'm installing this for the for the third time now, so that's why I'm putting a 3 here in the install directory. This is the component that I'm going to be installing. I accept the license. And here we go. It is now installing my application. And if I go into program files right here, program files, so this is where I installed it, it just works. And hello, beautiful world. So hello, beautiful world. All right. So how did I get to this? So let me first define the Qt installer framework. Well, what is it? It's a set of awesome tools that can be used on Linux, Windows, and Mac to create an installer. Now, I will say that I am focusing on Windows because that's where an installer really makes the most sense. And the main tools that we're going to use are 2 programs. One is called Binary Creator, and the other one is called RepoGen. And they are in the bin directory of the Qt install framework. So what does Binary Creator do? Well, Binary Creator takes in a set of folders, typically config and packages, and I'll talk about what's in those folders. So it takes those folders and it generates a beautiful installer. And that installer has the typical pages that you'll see in an installer. It can be distributed to my friends. And when they click on the installer, essentially what will happen is that it'll install the application as you saw previously. It will also put next to the application a maintenance tool. The maintenance tool I can use to uninstall. The command to run Binary Creator, I put this right here. This is the command to run Binary Creator. Now, of course, this all depends on where my Qt installer framework is on my file system. I give it a config file right here. That's the -C. And I tell Binary Creator where the packages are, the packages that need to be bundled up as data in the installer. And here, this parameter here at the end is in fact the name of the installer. It's called install. All right, let me walk through the tools and the input data. Let me actually go further and explain what is in the config and packages folder, right? So in the config folder, I have the config.xml, and alternatively, if I want to do something called controller scripting, I have a script called controller.qs. We'll look into more detail what I put in the config.xml and what I put in the controller.qs. Now, in the packages folder, I have, in fact, all the components that I see in the select components page of the installer, right? Here I just put one, but there could be many, right? And every component has two folders. One is data, which contains the payload that has to be installed. And the second folder is the metadata that you, who is creating this installer, will put in to customize the installer. All right, let me talk about RepoGen. So RepoGen is the other tool that you will use often. So in the previous example, and in the example that I showed you, the installer was an offline installer, but you can have an online installer. So what you could do is that the packages directory that is here, that I talked about here, you can run it as an input to the RepoGen program, and that will generate a repository directory. And that repository directory or folder can be uploaded to an HTTP server. And I can then, using an installer also created with Binary Creator that I showed you in the previous slide, whose config file specifies that I am using an online HTTP server for the packages. Well, that installer will be an online installer. So let me talk a little bit about what's in the config folder. There are really two entities. One is this config file, and this config file really should be in pretty much in every installer that you create. I provided here an example, right? And you're essentially customizing the general behavior of the installer. So notice that, for instance, the style of my installer is arrow. There are a few styles to choose from. They are the same styles that you know of for people who use QWizard in C++. You can have a default width, a default height, the name of the installer, the title. So all of these things give a general feel of what your installer is going to look like, and it will put the appropriate metadata on the appropriate pages in the appropriate place. Now, we can customize the installer further by doing something that's called control scripting. And the idea is here that in the config file, we don't see it here, but in the config file, there is an entry that you could put in, which is control script. Oh yeah, it's right here. You guys see that? Control script. And I specify I essentially specify here that what is to be followed is what's in controller.qs, which is a script file. And what you can do with the script file here is that you can add and remove pages to the wizard. You can interact with the UI by simulating user clicks. You can change existing pages, and you can also interact with the metadata defined in config.xml. So what you see there, where I wrote the console.log, and yes, this is meant to remind you what you do in QML, the console.log. There is debug info. You can put debug information when you run the installer using the option -D, and you run this. You'll see that debug information. And so what you see at console.log is actually the entry point of your installer. This is where you could put a bunch of code. And here what I did is one of my clients did not want to see the intro page. So what I did, and yes, I'll admit it's a little hackage, but what I did is that as soon as the installer shows up, the next button is clicked without the user seeing anything. I go to the next page, which is the license agreement page, and I hook up to the license agreement page callback. This is provided to me by the API. I hook up another function, and I say, listen, the previous page, the introduction page, don't show it. Make it invisible. So what this does is that when I start the installer, I immediately go to the license agreement page. Now, if you want to know more about how to do controller scripting, I've provided this link. I must say that the documentation for the Qt install framework is really, really well done. I can customize the installer further by, now, of course, every package directory or component directory that we have here has a packages.xml file. And what you see on the left here is typically what you would find in a package.xml file. And so there are two things that are presented here. The first thing is, if you look at the operations, the operations entry here in the XML, what I am essentially doing is I am telling my installer for this particular component what should happen when it installs the actual component. The other thing that I did is that I told the installer, hey, there are a few pages of mine that I defined using Qt Creator. You guys remember the UI files Qt Designer, the UI files in Qt Designer. Here are a few pages that I created with Qt Designer. I want them in the installer when this component is loaded. I am declaring them here in the packages.xml file. So this is what component scripting looks like, okay? And so in this case, what we did, so what I did here is that I could have done what I do here. Here, this operations entry that I have here, I could have taken it away and done it in the component scripting. And that's what I do here. So what I'm doing here is I'm specifying what is supposed to happen when the installer installs this particular component, right? So all I'm doing is that I'm redefining create operations. I am calling the base implementation, if you will, of create operations. And then I'm doing something else on Windows. For Windows, I am creating a shortcut and an entry in the start menu of Windows. Now, further, this is another example of customizing the installer here I'm really customizing the UI. So what I'm doing is that I am inserting those UI files that I talked about, right? So if you notice here, where am I doing it? So what I'm doing is that I'm setting all the pages here. Here I'm setting all the pages to visible to false. I want to hide those and I want to show my own, right? And notice that here I am installing a wizard page. Target widget is actually the object name of my main object, my main UI object in the UI file. And I have access to the different here, target chooser, target directory, all of these things, they are defined in the UI file and I have access to them. And I have access to, I can hook up to the signals of those UI objects that are in the UI file, right? I can hook up and then hook them up to my own functions that I can define here, right? Now, to have access to the metadata, I may want to have access to the metadata. The function that I can use here for the function is value, right? Value, which returns a string. Now, value, and I give it the key which is the XML tag. All right. Now, this I will admit there is a bit of a learning curve for this to do both the component scripting and the controller scripting. However, the documentation is pretty well done. So if you go to this link here at the bottom, you'll see the API that will allow you to do both of that scripting. So you have this Qt desktop services, which allows you to open a URL with a browser that's in the background. You have access to all the standard file dialogues, so open files, save file. You have access to the message boxes. You have access to the system info. So on what OS am I? I really encourage you to go through this API. I also have to say that there are a ton of examples. So if you go through the Qt installer framework documentation, there are a ton of examples that they show you where these scripts are used, where there's a lot of scripting done. Sorry. All right. So let's talk about some deployment issues, right? One of the problems that you will probably encounter is that with your installer, especially if it's a Qt application, there are dependencies that have to be put into your installer. And in terms of Qt dependencies, there is this wonderful tool that's called WinDeployQt for Windows. That what it does is that if you give it a bin, you give it a directory, right? You give it the directory where you have your executable that you want to distribute, and you call WinDeployQt on it. And what it will do is that it will be smart enough to install the correct dependencies that your application needs on Windows so that it can run pretty much on any Windows machine, regardless of if Qt is installed or not. Now, if you guys check a little, I wrote a blog on the ICS.com webpage. And in that blog, what I had done is that I had played around with the Qt install framework. And what I had done is I used QMake at the time, the profile. And so there's a whole project. What it does is that it does a little what I did at the beginning of my presentation, but it does it with the profile in QMake. So what it does, it builds the application. It puts that application in a destination directory, which is actually the data folder of the package that I want that application to be in. And then it applies this WinDeployQt tool on that directory, on that data directory, right? So this is it's done. So I pasted here the lines in the profile that do that, right? Now, I want to talk a little bit about Mac. So Mac, you may want to consider if you want to use an installer on Mac, especially for an application, because Mac users actually typically are not used to installers. They are used to bundles that you receive, that they receive or that they download, right? And when you build a Qt application on Mac, typically what you actually build is a bundle. You can apply Mac deploy Qt on that bundle and then distribute that bundle. And Mac users typically know what to do with that bundle. They will, if it's an application, drag it to the applications folder. Now, there is something called Linux deploy Qt. It is not distributed by the Qt company. However, so it's third party, but what it will allow you to create a deployable app directory. So yeah, it will allow you to create a deployable app directory. It will also allow you to create something called an app image, which also may make it not necessary to have an installer. All right, let me talk a little bit about keeping the apps updated, right? So if you have an online installer and you have some modifications and you've run binary creator on, you built your app and you run binary creator, what you then do is that you need to somehow announce to the world that there are updates. So you can run repo.gen and you run it with the update new components option, and you run it on your packages folder, and it will create a new repository that you upload. And then the users can run maintenance tool.exe check updates, and it'll look at that repository, that uploaded repository, and will tell the user if there is an update or not. Now, you can also do it programmatically so that the user doesn't have to do this maintenance tool.exe check updates. Now, there is a really good example of this in the documentation, and I've put a link right here at the bottom. Okay, now, this is actually what was the most fun for me, right? It was integrating into a CMake project. And here's the thing. Everything I told you about the input, about the config folder and the packages folder, you don't have to write. It is all done for you. So all that input structure that you had to write, that I had to write in my previous blog with QMake, you don't have to do anymore, right? So the idea, what you're going to do is that you're going to use something called CPAC, right? And you're going to, so CPAC is a CMake module that allows you to create packages, right? Or a graphical installer. Now, to create a graphical installer, you have to tell CPAC, hey, CPAC, the generator that you need to use is here, IFW, right? That's the Qt install framework. Now, I know that a lot of CMake users, CMake purists are going to cringe here with this line. I'm just putting it there for learning purposes. It is necessary. You need to tell CPAC the location of the installer, of the Qt installer framework, or else it won't work, It'll tell you, I can't find this generator, no such thing. When you do this, it is important that you have the install directive in your CMake file. So the install directive that you have here, right? And give that install directive a component name. I talked about the WinDeploy Qt step, and that step is a little bit tricky on the in the CMake when you use CMake, right? What you have to do is in your CMake file, you have to set this variable here, cpack pre-build scripts, cpack underscore pre underscore build scripts, right? And you have to give it a CMake script, the CMake script that you see here at the bottom, right? So what I did here, so if you look at the CMake file that I wrote for this project that I illustrated at the beginning of this talk, what I did is that in the CMake file, I actually call this, I have it look for WinDeploy Qt. And once it finds it, now you only do this on Windows, right? So there should be some directive that said if Windows, right? And when deploy Qt, after deploy Qt is found, right, this script can be executed, right? Okay. Now, I do want to say this whole example where we do this, is available online. There are actually two examples. There's an offline example and there's an online example, and we will make that available for you. And the idea, one of the big things about this is that it was very hard to find examples, and we wanted to just put boilerplate code that gives you like simple examples that you can rip off. Now, another thing that you can do is, so remember all that metadata that you put in XML files? You don't have to do that anymore, okay? You put that in your CMake file. And there is a direct relation, a direct mapping between all of these things and one of the config file tags one of the config file XML tags, right? So remember the wizard style was arrow? Okay. The same thing goes for the components. So in every components, I don't need to worry anymore about not only the packages folder, but the data folder. And then for the packages folder, all I need to do is call this function, this cpack function, cpack underscore ifw configure underscore component. And there is, for every entry that I can put into packages, in a packages.xml file, there is a cpack variable here or option, okay? Very important, you need to let cpack know that there is a component. The component that I specified here in the install directive. So before I end this talk, I wanted to extend a special thank you to my colleagues. Jean-Philippe Lompré created the online installer project with CMake and CPAC. Chris Rizzatello is part of the KDE project, and he along with Jigorsh, Rahim, Austin, created the contents of this talk. And I also want to thank Janelle, who also helped put together this talk. All right, and so I would be available for more questions. we can continue the discussion in the speaker's lounge. I should be there for the next 30 minutes. And thank you for the talk. Thank you.